hold back the tears.
Honestly, I did not care about Ayrton today because it was a Brazilian Grand Prix. I just wanted to do well. And
why so many F1 legends turned against Alain Prost? There is a list, not a written one. No document, no official record. But anyone who spent time in the Formula One paddock between 1981 and 1993 could recite it from memory. Drivers who, at various points, publicly turned against Alain Prost. Teammates who requested reassignment. Team principals who said one thing in contracts and another in interviews. A Ferrari board that terminated a 4-time world champion mid-season and felt justified doing it. The list is long. What's strange is how many names on it once trusted him completely. Alain Prost won 51 Formula One Grands Prix. He holds, to this day, one of the most precisely engineered careers the sport has ever produced. He did not win by being faster than everyone. He won by making fewer mistakes than everyone, by thinking further ahead, by understanding that survival was a strategy and strategy was a weapon. And that weapon left marks on almost every person who stood beside him. The pattern begins early. Renault, 1983. Prost has just finished runner-up in the championship for the second consecutive season. Renault, having invested heavily in their works program and received no title in return, begins a quiet internal process of reassigning blame. The car's reliability failures, documented across race weekends, are gradually reframed in team communications as driver performance issues. Prost did not wait to be fired. He read the room, negotiated his exit terms, and moved to McLaren. He was 28. He was already operating like someone who understood that in this sport, the story told about you matters as much as what actually happened. What changed at McLaren, what changed for the rest of his career, is that Prost began shaping that story himself. Not through lies, through placement, through the careful management of what information reached whom and when and in what framing. In a paddock built on leverage, he simply learned to use it earlier than anyone else. 1. René Arnoux. The first name on the list is René Arnoux. And the argument could be made that Arnoux deserved what happened at Dijon in 1979, that two drivers fighting for position in the closing laps of a Grand Prix, wheel to wheel at 200 kilometers per hour, is exactly what the sport is supposed to look like. Arnoux thought so. He was aggressive. He gave nothing. He drove Prost to the edge of the circuit 4 separate times in the final laps and accepted the result. Second place. Without complaint in the immediate aftermath. What he did not accept in the years that followed was the way Prost characterized what had happened. In interviews, in media appearances, in the slow accumulation of his public image, Prost's version of Dijon positioned Arnoux as the dangerous one, the reckless one, the driver who had nearly caused a catastrophe. Arnoux' version, that it was equal, that both men were racing hard, that there was nothing irregular, rarely received the same platform. By the time Arnoux was consistently positioned as a footnote to Prost's heroism, there was no mechanism left to correct it. Arnoux said in an interview that received little coverage outside France. He was talented, but he always needed someone to blame, and he was very good at choosing people who couldn't fight back effectively. Arnoux was still fighting back. Nobody was particularly listening. 2. Nelson Piquet. Nelson Piquet did not dislike many people quietly. When Piquet had a grievance, it arrived with specific language in specific venues at specific volume. His problem with Prost was not personal in the way that Senna's would become. It was professional, and in some ways more damaging for being so. Piquet's argument, made across multiple interviews in the late 1980s and repeated with diminishing patience as the decade closed, was that Prost had figured out how to win championships in a car that Piquet could also have won in, and then used team politics to ensure Piquet would never be offered the same machinery at the same time. This was not a provable claim. It was also not an uncommon one. Piquet had watched Prost at Renault, at McLaren, and then at Williams, 3 of the most competitive cars of the era, and noted that Prost had managed to occupy the right seat at the right moment with a consistency that exceeded statistical coincidence. He was political, Piquet said. Everything was political with him. The car, the engineers, the press. He managed everything. A real driver just drives. What Piquet left unsaid was the implication that Prost's championships were, at some level, managed rather than earned. The accusation never stuck cleanly. Prost's lap times did not need defending, but it altered how a section of the paddock read him, as someone who had won not just by being better, but by ensuring the conditions under which he competed were never equal. 3. Ayrton Senna. Senna called him a coward in public, at a press conference, with cameras running. This was not a moment of anger. Senna did not operate impulsively in that environment. It was a considered statement, delivered with the specific intent of placing something on the record that could not be retracted. The collision at Suzuka in 1989 had ended the championship fight. Prost, having already signed with Ferrari and publicly announced his departure, was awarded the title after Senna's disqualification. Whether the contact was deliberate, accidental, or something in the space between, that debate has never fully closed. What closed was the relationship. In 1990, at Suzuka again, Senna drove into Prost at the first corner and took them both out of the race. He admitted it afterward, not immediately, but eventually, with the calm acknowledgement of someone who had decided the accounting was fair. One deliberate collision answered for another. Simple mathematics. The problem with simple mathematics is that they require agreement on what is being measured. Prost denied the 1989 contact was intentional until the end. He maintained it with the steadiness of a man who had spent a career managing what he was willing to confirm. Senna's version, that Prost had closed the door deliberately, that the entire season had been conducted in bad faith, became the dominant public narrative, partly because Senna expressed it with a directness that Prost's measured style could not match in the court of general opinion. Prost won the argument in the steward's room. Senna won it everywhere else. 4. Ferrari, Cesare Fiorio and the board. The Ferrari chapter is the one that most clearly reveals what Prost was willing to trade. He arrived in 1990 as a 4-time champion with the leverage that title count implies and began immediately performing beyond what the car should have allowed. He drove through mechanical deficits that would have produced midfield results for a different driver. He brought Ferrari closer to a championship than they had been in over a decade. And then, in 1991, mid-season, with the championship already out of reach and the car deteriorating under him race by race, he told a journalist the Ferrari was a truck. 2 words in a paddock garage interview, with no advance warning to the team. Within weeks, Ferrari's board had made their decision. His contract was terminated before the season concluded. He was paid his remaining fee and asked not to return. The Ferrari board did not elaborate publicly beyond what was required. Cesare Fiorio, then sporting director, was more direct in subsequent years. Prost had, in his view, used the press as a negotiating tool throughout his time at the team, building external pressure to extract internal concessions, protecting his own position by managing what appeared in the newspapers. The truck quote was not an accident. It was the last move in a negotiation that had been running since 1990, and it had simply landed harder than Prost anticipated. He left Maranello with his reputation intact and his relationship with the team permanently closed. Ferrari had longer institutional memory than any other entity in the sport. 5. Nigel Mansell. Mansell's grievance was the most direct of all of them, because it was the only one with a clear, verifiable mechanism. When Williams began negotiating driver contracts for the 1993 season, Prost, returning from his sabbatical year, used a clause in his agreement to block Mansell's re-signing. The clause existed. Prost invoked it. Mansell left for IndyCar. He won the IndyCar championship in his first season. He gave an interview shortly after clinching it that was widely interpreted in the British press as being directed specifically at Prost. He did not name him. He did not need to. The framing was sufficient. What made Mansell's departure different from the other fractures on this list was its visibility. There was no ambiguity about what had happened or who had made it happen. Prost had exercised a contractual right and removed a competitor from his environment. It was legal. It was strategic. And within 18 months, the competitor he had removed was holding a championship trophy in a different series, having proved, in the most public way available, that the talent Prost had sidelined was real. The clause was within the rules. What it said about the man who used it was a different conversation entirely. The signature moment. There is a press conference from late 1993. Prost has just announced his retirement, his second, his final. He sits at the table with the composure of someone who has sat at many tables and learned that composure is itself a form of information control. A journalist asks him, "Given everything, is there anything he would have done differently?" He considers the question, not performing consideration, actually sitting with it. He says, "In motor racing, you do what is necessary." The journalist writes it down. The room moves to the next question. 5 months later, Ayrton Senna was dead at Imola, and the sentence had a weight it was never supposed to carry. Prost had answered for himself. History answered for both of them. What connects Arnoux, Piquet, Senna, the Ferrari board, and Mansell is not that Prost wronged them all equally. He didn't. Some of what happened between these men was competitive reality. Some of it was the inevitable friction of elite ambition operating in close proximity. Some of it was straightforwardly Prost's doing, executed with the same precision he applied to every other problem in his career. What connects them is the recognition. Each of these men, at different moments, arrived at the same reading of the same person. That Prost operated in a space between the written rules and the unwritten ones, and that he was more comfortable in that space than anyone else in the paddock had any right to be. He did not cheat. The sport rewarded exactly what he did: strategy, information management, political awareness. These were not violations of any code. They were extensions of the same intelligence that produced 51 victories and 4 championships. The sport rewarded what he was. It simply could not forgive him for being it so completely. At Senna's funeral, Prost carried the coffin through the streets of São Paulo. He looked forward. His face gave nothing away. Around him were the people who had watched, competed against, been damaged by, and, some of them, loved the man in the coffin. Prost stood among them in the precise way he had always stood among his rivals. Present, composed, and fundamentally alone. He had done what was necessary. That is what he said in 1993. What nobody told him, what perhaps he already knew, is that doing what is necessary with sufficient precision for a sufficient number of years eventually leaves you carrying the only person who ever truly understood you,